Welcome to Two Chuds in the Beer Castle. I'm your host, Josh Hartsock.
I'm your co-host Liam.
I will be talking about why I don't believe Plato's critique of the artist in the Ion is compelling, and
My thesis regards the overarching reason why someone would be an aesthetic objectivist, and I say because they believe in some sort of higher truth, because beauty in a Platonic sense leads to truth, and this truth, when revealed, is pleasing in a deeper and immaterial way.
right. So I will start off talking about Plato's critique of the artist in the Ion. So Plato talks about how the artist is divinely inspired, and it starts at the divine, the muses. They inspire the author of a play, a book, a poem, and that can be transferred down to rhapsodes who recite it, and that can be transferred down to the audience. And his critique occurs in a dialogue between Socrates and Ion, who's a rhapsode reciting Homer's plays, and he says that the artist Ion is just in a Bacchic frenzy, divinely inspired, reciting stuff without any knowledge of what he's reciting, um, and that because of this, it is the audience and the philosopher who should determine what you can gain, what kind of philosophical insights you can gain from the work of art, and not the artists themselves. However, I believe that viewpoint is a bit short-sighted and narrow, and limits its response by focusing on someone who recites the work of art rather than a dialogue with, say, the author like Homer. For example, the Ion doesn't address the kind of thought and plan that has to go into crafting a story as defined in Aristotle's Poetics, where he talks about what defines plays, specifically tragedies and comedies, as having foremost the plot, the character, the diction, which is how it's composed, the thought, which is what's invoked by the actions in the story, the spectacle, what we see on stage, and then the song. So, my argument here is that the author must be knowledgeable and insightful about what he is writing about if he is to convey it in a comprehensive manner that is understandable to a lay audience or whoever is reading it, because of the defined structure from plot to song. It's improbable to have such a regiment structure and not have an insightful artist behind that. And part of the reason why I say this is because to claim that the artist is just divinely inspired is to claim that there's no kind of scientific method or procedure that goes into the work, which is contradicted by Aristotle's definition of what makes a tragedy and a comedy. And then to cap off this point with Aristotle, he ends up with talking about how more truth can be conveyed in art than history. Um, and I guess, Liam, I wanted to get your thoughts to see if you agree with that interpretation.
So your idea simply is that Plato's idea that the artist cannot explain what he's doing is because is kind of disputed by Aristotle, because Aristotle decomposes and breaks down the different forms of storytelling into different categories and examines how the artist actually crafted the story put together, because when you examine it, there is definitely intention behind it. Is that what you're saying?
Correct, yes.
um I mean, yeah, I guess I agree with that. I mean, a point of dispute could be, when you're an artist, you kind of, I mean, maybe divine inspiration might not be the term some people would use today, but when you're an artist, you kind of just like you just have ideas like flow through your head, but those ideas are predetermined by some sort of outside factor.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, there could be an instance where you just come up with something completely random, or I don't know, and you insert it in the story. Um, but Aristotle examining this, would this really disprove that? Because Aristotle's not saying like, oh, you can't be like divinely inspired because blah blah blah. It's, you know, it's more of just like a breakdown of like stories, and I don't think stories, that are quote unquote divinely inspired are, as broken down by, a full analysis of, what you've written.
Right. Yeah, I see what you mean. I think a good segue to expand upon this point is to talk about um, Sophocles' story, Oedipus, and how he crafts a story to talk about um, the fate of individuals, of humans, in a way that like your actions, your follies, your successes, what happens to you, what you do, what you are is in a sense like your fate, what you're fated to do, not in a sense of that there's a puppet master um, controlling you to do so, but just that it's like your follies and successes are a result of who you are as an individual, and that is your fate. What my argument here would be is that, well, yes, there's definitely times as where writers will have a random inspiration or idea to put into your story to be able to craft a story about human nature and nurture and your own fate. You would have to have a level of understanding about it where you can not only understand it yourself, but put it into words such that a audience can understand it. Because one of the common things that at least I've seen, I'm sure you've seen in academia, is when you learn something, one of the best indicators to tell that you understand something is if you can convey it to someone else and have them understand it. So in that same vein, I'm arguing that for an author or an artist in this case to convey an idea, philosophy, anything that the audience can understand, they have to have at least some level of understanding of it themselves that they could explain to you as a debunk to the notion that the artist does not know how to interpret their own work. Um, does that example make sense?
I guess I feel like this is definitely one of the better examples for your point. Um, I mean, I can't really think of any story, you know, besides maybe some like modern like stoner like culture
Right, right.
stories that just kind of have like that randomness to it, that are, quote unquote divinely inspired.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I'd say like every story is, influenced. Well, it's the author of every story is influenced by something to write such a story. I honestly can't think of anything that, would say otherwise.
Right. And it's funny that you mentioned that, like, this isn't like an all-encompassing case. Like, as you said, there's definitely like some people who might, trip off acid, have some wild thought, and write something completely bizarre that can only be described as like a quote unquote divinely inspired. And I think that highlights an issue I had with the Ion, and that Laudrier mentions in their problems with the Ion is that when Plato constructs the dialogue between Socrates and Ion, Ion being someone who merely recites plays, he doesn't allow the author, or what I would call the true artist behind the work, to refute or comment on the points he makes with Socrates. He just talks about someone who recites. And someone who recites something, all they have to do is memorize it. And in that sense, you could, say, read a book about fish biology and know nothing about it, and then recite it to a T. And, maybe it would sound like you understand it because you recite it perfectly, but you don't actually have to know it to recite it. So I believe what Plato is truly critiquing with the Ion is not necessarily the artist in a broad sense, like an author of a book or a scriptwriter of a movie, but people who simply parrot what the true artist says and passes it off as their own form of art. What are your thoughts on that?
Um, yeah, no, this, uh, so, okay, so the poet just recites the art and just fails to inspect like any, any true intention of the author. I mean, that lies almost certainly on the fault of the whoever's reciting, and not really, um, the author who wrote whatever they're reading. And yeah, no, I wouldn't say that like proves anything Plato really said. I mean, what he said is correct, but I don't see how it's relevant to his original point about being like divinely inspired, because like you can be inspired by anything that surrounds you, including things you're just gonna read off of.
Right. And I think the what my main point going there is that just because you are inspired by something, because in both cases we acknowledge that the true artist, let's say as the author of the book, play, movie scriptwriter, they can be inspired by stuff, but to convey something effectively, they have to understand it at some kind of level, versus the person who recites it, say the rhapsode like Ion, or maybe the actor who just reads off a script. They don't necessarily have to understand the philosophy trying to be conveyed by the author to be able to deliver on a performance by just repeating it, in which case the Ion would be less of a critique of the artist generally and more of a specific kind of artist. And the last thing I want to talk about briefly is an example, more in depth, of how I believe an artist conveys a critique of certain types of philosophies in an effective way that demonstrates that they have some kind of level of understanding and could explain the philosophies behind their work. And the work I'm talking about is Tite Kubo's Bleach, and a paper that breaks it down really well is by David John Boyd, who writes Hollowed Out, Exhuming an Ethics of Hollowing in Tite Kubo's Bleach. So, to give a brief synopsis, the primary antagonist who lasts throughout the majority of the series is a critique on a combination of Heideggerian metaphysics and Nietzschean nihilism. They take the stance of God is dead, and they don't find any meaning in life. And because of that kind of despair and no meaning in existence, rather than just succumbing to it, what they decide to do is to take charge and sit on that empty throne of God and kind of recreate the world in their own image. And what this is supposed to reflect is it's contextualized to a postmodern, post-World War Japan. And the negativity in this philosophy is displayed by Kubo in his setting of Hueco Mundo. And Hueco Mundo is a sand desert that's based off I believe it's based off an Aztec hell, and it embodies animalistic instinct and survival of the fittest. It's a very violent interpretation of social Darwinism, in the fact that the lifestyle of what are known as hollows, the monsters in the series, their lifestyle there is just eat weaker beings to survive. And that kind of lifestyle is ruled by their false king and the antagonist of the series, Eisen. And it's a pseudo critique on totalitarianism and the ontology of war, as Kubo takes Eisen through a power-hungry journey in which he has him rule over an animalistic instinctual realm where it's the strong eat the weak to survive, and it's a self-perpetuating cycle of war. And he contrasts this with the hero and the hero's mentor, in which case the hero's mentor, instead of taking the interpretation that Eisen took, in which there is no meaning in life, we should work to erase the current world and create something new. The hero and their mentor embrace what Boyd refers to as a powerless power, which comes from embracing the finitude of human existence. And what he means by this is that, regardless of what views you take because of what has been shaped by the past, um, regardless of how seemingly meaningless uh, existence can seem, that you can take meaning in embracing um, the finite aspect of human existence. And he uses this to convey his primary philosophy in the series, that true courage is not trying to uh, ignore and run from the state of the current world as Eisen does by trying to disregard its meaningless and run away to a new world, but to embrace that fact and recognize that while in some cases it may feel like you're walking in the face of death, to continue walking on is what true courage is. And I believe that to convey something um, with enough nuance and complexity like Kubo does through Bleach over a massive near 700 chapter span, Kubo himself would have to intentionally set up these philosophies to explore and critique, rather than just being inspired divinely or through other means and kind of write in a frenzy where all of this information kit is solely comes together by happenstance rather than being intentionally crafted there for the reader to pick up. And I've been rambling for a lot, but that's basically I think one of a good go-to example for why the Ion's broad critique of the artist fails in truly criticizing the artist's ability to convey philosophy. And do you have any other final thoughts? I know it was a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. Yeah, no, I feel like that's a very good analysis of Kubo's Bleach. I've only just started reading it, but I actually got to a few parts that you mentioned. I mean, yeah, no, I feel like Plato should have been a lot more careful in the Ion, because he said that every artist
Yeah.
is divinely inspired. I mean, sure, like you can be inspired by things, but to say that it's being inspired by one source, divinity, is I feel like that's a bit too general. And yeah, also I saw in your notes you mentioned uh Eisen's oops, I'm sorry. Yeah, you scrolled the other way. That's right. Um, Eisen's philosophy is basically, that of Carl Schmitt's, who's probably one of the biggest. He's essentially the Nazi Party's like chief philosopher,
Right.
and essentially, the same way, Heidegger interprets his metaphysics, and combined with Nietzsche's nihilistic tendencies, is you get like basically this, God no longer exists, so let's just have the state replace that. And that's it's kind of led to this all the infamous ideologies of the 20th century, such as Stalinism, Nazism, fascism. You could probably like have any like political ideology and have it just co-opted by this nihilistic and this tendency for the state to just control every single apparatus of your life. And yeah, Eisen is yeah, he definitely represents that within the story, especially since he's revolting and trying to create this new world in his view.
Yeah. Thanks for partaking in that conversation. Now we'll move on to your thesis.
All right, so yeah, so this topic concerns aesthetic objectivism, which is the belief that there's some sort of true beauty that's outside of human definition. Like if everyone just closed their eyes, beauty would still exist no matter what. So my thesis is that the overarching reason why someone would be an aesthetic objectivist is because they believe in some sort of higher truth. Now, this higher truth is because beauty will lead to this higher truth, at least in a Platonic sense. And this truth, when revealed, is pleasing in more of a deeper and immaterial way. Now, the word truth is a bit vague here, but it kind of means the same thing across like different categories. Now, To simplify this, I kind of split it into three categories. There's probably the easiest type of beauty, or at least platonic beauty we can understand, which is, probably divinity. Now, and then there's um, I guess beauty more of a mathematical and scientific or rational view. And there's also beauty in a little bit. This one's probably the not beauty, sorry, truth. Uh, the truth that's a little bit harder to explain than the others. It has to do with I'm gonna call it like communal beauty. I'll get to that later. So so first off, like there's two main works where Plato describes beauty. There's the Symposium and the Phaedrus. So in the Symposium, Plato describes beauty from its material forms to its more abstract forms. So basically, he describes beauty as a ladder, basically, and each rung represents different like levels of beauty. And the higher up the ladder is, the closer you are to this absolute beauty, which is associated with absolute truth in the some sort of higher form. Beauty, as referred to as Plato, is considered the highest form, and the people that love beauty at its highest form are known as the philosophers, according to that's a little bit hard to pronounce. Suzanne Objdrolek. I'll say it like that, Objdrolek. Yeah, and they define Plato's Symposium, as basically a description of beauty, and it's also about love. I won't ignore that, but he describes beauty as a essentially the well, no, love is like the force between beauty. Yeah, so beauty is essentially how or what people are attracted to, and this highest beauty is what we all try and achieve, but only a few philosophers, quote unquote, have achieved such a sense of beauty. So you got any thoughts, buddy?
Yeah, so I've always found it interesting when first taking this class and reading the Symposium and learning about like the ladder of love and how that applies to beauty, and finding like the form of the beautiful, and that like since the very modern view of it is like beauty's in the eye of the beholder, and I almost feel like that definition gets encompassed inside this ladder if you look at it more of kind of like a web where you have like the truest beauty, and it webs out into various other things that other people can find beautiful. Like let's say I find something beautiful and you don't, that doesn't make it not beautiful, it just makes it beautiful to me, but that still comes from down a ladder, down a web, from that true beauty. So I almost think in a way it's interesting that we've adopted such a beauty's in the eye of the beholder viewpoint, and almost kind of fail to see how that almost fits into an aesthetic objectivist viewpoint without really contradicting it.
Yeah, this will be discussed by Scruton's point a little bit later. So, yeah, no, the web analogy actually like works pretty well because, I mean, Plato's like, distinction between beauties is a little, I mean, I guess to our modern view, it's a little bit arbitrary, but, back then in ancient Greece, that was a very rigid hierarchy of like morality. So, on the lowest form, you have like, the materialistic like pleasures, good food, good wine, and, probably sex as well. And then later on, you kind of get higher up, like, romantic, some romance, like the whole like I love you based on your personality kind of thing.
Yeah.
Then you keep going further, and then you have some sort of like familial love, like you love your family because they cared for you, and you want to take care of them in return. I'm trying to think of all the the Greek words for love, but eventually you reach the highest form of love, and I guess like the best way to call it would be agape, as it's popular in a lot of Christian philosophy, which actually leads me on to my next point. So, Patrick Sherry in his work he basically gives like a little history of Platonic beauty, and well, not just Platonic beauty, but all beauty, but specifically in the section about Platonic beauty, he talks about how this idea was eventually adopted by a lot of Christian theologians in the during the early church period. So essentially, this highest idea of beauty is associated with God Himself. And, as you approach God, you will see this higher and higher beauty, which all good things stem from. And, as you approach God and His beauty, you reach the highest truth. So essentially, beauty is, the it's pretty much verbatim what Plato said, except instead of having this like abstract idea, you have some deity behind it. Yeah, and this was ideas like this were adopted a lot by Christian theologians such as Augustine and Aquinas later on. You have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, when you were talking about this, almost like comparing like the latter, and more the Greek view with like the ladder versus the more, I guess, the Christian view with getting closer and closer to the beauty of God. It kind of reminded me of the Divine Comedy, because we were talking about this a while ago, with how when he was traveling through heaven, there was like rings, and as he got closer and closer, it got I guess brighter, more divine, and I guess in the applicable sense here, like more beautiful. I also find it interesting how like you can kind of take that ladder analogy and like kind of apply it to like, I guess, the mundane, with like like love for appearance, personality, family, whatever, and then kind of like shift that and apply it to like your belief system in a religious sense, with eventually attaining like the beauty of God. And I think that's powerful in the sense of why many people would want to be an aesthetic objectivist, since many people around the world in some fashion or another are religious, and their religion is important to them. So yeah, I think that was an interesting point.
Yeah, while you were speaking and I was listening, going back to a conversation I had, we actually like talked about how the, there's an issue with the English language, and it's that love has, there's only one word for love, while in Greek there's maybe like 5 or 6 different words,
Right.
and they all mean like different forms. And yeah, and Plato seems to like place them on this ladder, but I've also seen people just place them. This isn't like a part of a source. This is just more of a anecdote. But I've seen people put them in a not a web, but like more of a cycle ish, because some are more related to each other. You have like loves of people, you have loves of material things, and then you have loves of like higher orders, and they all kind of like connect to each other sort of, and they all surround like what beauty, love. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but basically Plato says love is a force that attracts us to beauty. It's not a thing. Beauty is a thing, but love is more of like a like the force between two things.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose that makes it a thing, but I mean like more of a abstract idea thing.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense.
All right. So moving on to the next definition of truth would be truth in, I guess, mathematics and science. So what this may sound a bit weird, but in nature, humans tend to be more attracted to people and things that invoke some sort of symmetry. We'll see this in generally who might be attracted to who in psychology. We'll see it in art. We'll see it in architecture. We'll see it in many different places. We'll see it in nature, and so a lot of these symmetries will also appear in mathematics and physics. And it's interesting to I guess in the modern day, science is held in regard as this, the highest of truths. And, as we delve further into our understanding of the universe on its most fundamental scales, we actually approach like different symmetries. Now, what symmetry in the sense of like fundamental physics is a little bit complicated and different than just looking at a circle and saying like, hey, it's symmetrical along every axis to its center. So yeah, so symmetry in physics could be, you know, what's a good example?
The one thing that comes to my mind is like motion of particles, a larger particle, and like I don't know, maybe like an electron orbiting an atom, and like planets orbiting stars. That kind of is
Yeah,
that what
I mean,
that's for?
sort of, but yes, I guess that would be true in a classical sense. But I was thinking more of a in a modern sense. When you flip the well, actually, it's kind of funny because we always assume that there was a well, actually, no, this is true, but there's a charge symmetry. So let's say you have, different sets of, you have a set of electrons and positrons. They're both antiparticles of each other. And let's say you have this magic wand, and this magic wand transforms every electron into a positron and transforms every positron into an electron. If that happens, the same exact outcome will happen once you start time, because even though they have different signs, the forces between each particle will always be the same, because regardless of their signs. So this is what is known as charge symmetry between regular matter and antimatter. Because if you have well, if you know the standard model, there's a slew of different particles, some of which have
Yeah,
charge, and their antimatter counterparts will have the opposite charge. So as I said, electrons have negative charge, while positrons have positive charge.
mhm.
And then there's also parity. Well, parity used to be symmetry, but it's actually no longer symmetry because we found out that I think it's some sort of antineutrinos actually have like the same spin as their regular matter counterparts, despite them, being, antiparticles of each other,
Right.
which was a big finding. And I guess it kind of hurts this viewpoint of oh, this is truth and symmetry here. But yeah, but then there's charge parity symmetry, or CP symmetry. Okay, if we flip the charges now, will it work? Well, with a neutrino, you have no charge there, so no, it actually doesn't work. So CP symmetry is actually no longer a thing, and that's actually known as a CP violation. However, the way to fix this is to reverse time, because it's a little bit strange to explain this, but essentially, antimatter particles will act. No, okay, they won't exactly behave like regular matter particles going backwards in time. That's kind of like a mathematical trick that gets them to that basically agrees with what we observe, and the mathematics like totally work out. So
Right.
if you reverse the charge, you reverse the parity, and you reverse the time, then you get a symmetry between the universe. So let's say I take every particle in this universe, flip it with their antimatter counterpart, and you'll have the exact same thing. Because if you flip it by its charge, parity, and time, it will act the same.
Right.
Yeah, it's a little bit wonky, but yeah. And then of course there's other theories that haven't really been confirmed yet, or even untestable, such as supersymmetry, where every matter particle has their own force matter particle counterpart, and vice versa. But that's not really a thing. That's known as supersymmetry.
Okay.
Do you have any thoughts
Yeah.
about
No,
that?
I think that like ties it together nicely, and like especially when you start off, like the human mind has like a uh, tends to kind of lean towards something that's symmetrical in that sense. And I think like in my own personal testimony, I can say that like yeah, I like to make connections between uh, like principles, and um, anything of like likeness when transferring from different kind of fields to another, and that kind of like symmetry, I think, does at least in like an academic sense, make the universe very beautiful. So I think that like I guess like a scientific truth, a religious truth, and then like the platonic truth of beauty. I think they all come together to form a compelling argument about there's something out there for everyone that would make you want to be an aesthetic objectivist.
Yeah, I should also mention that the this paper comes from Mello's paper, and there's actually like multiple examples of symmetry, not just in like different sciences, but also in different parts of fundamental physics. You'll find different symmetries, especially when you consider like Lie algebra and symmetry groups like U1 and U2, and it gets a little wonky after that. All right, and enough about physics. Let's return to the final point, and I'd say this might be the more important point because this concerns like not just theologians just pondering like divinity or the physicist in his lab nowadays, because this one considers pretty much everyone. So this relates to Roger Scruton's paper Why Beauty Matters. So, well, he himself isn't really writing on aesthetic objectivism. He rather is an aesthetic objectivist himself. And he is, I mean, he was, I shouldn't say he is because he passed away a couple of years ago, but he was very critical of subjectivism, especially in the postmodern sense. And he kind of led a large philosophical crusade against it, and his works were seen as more reactions to it rather than ideas that he just took from Plato. It's like he observes how the world is, and then he's like, wow, maybe Plato was right, rather than just declaring Plato was right and just confirming everything outside of his view is right. Essentially, he believes in aesthetic objectivism because he perceived negative social consequences of postmodern art and architecture. So this might be a little confusing, but with his paper Why Beauty Matters, he actually has a little documentary about that, which I enjoyed. But essentially, nowadays, well, maybe not always nowadays, but in more modern times, you'll have art and architecture that kind of embrace sort of like utility rather than some sort of aesthetic pleasure. So essentially, you'll have all these like flat, like concrete, apartment flats that, I mean, in my opinion, I don't really. I'm sure there could be like one or two people who enjoy looking at them, but I certainly don't. But they're essentially not very good looking. But at the same time, it's like every person has this set of square feet to live in, and you have entire like communities just looking the exact same, pretty drab and pretty. There's no like flavor to it. It's just this blatant like blandness that is just copy and pasted everywhere because it's deemed quote unquote the most useful because of something. I'm sure there's like better reasons to explain why you would make these apartments, but that's not really what Scruton focuses on. He focuses more on its effect on society because as these flats and this new bland architecture appears in reality, people don't really find that pleasing, and as a result there's no sense of like community because you live in this drab area where you just get up, work, go to bed, eat or something. Probably not in that order, but yeah. So essentially, his idea was that art lacks that intrinsic beauty that you would find in older societies, such as one of the examples he gave was in I forget where it was. I think it was somewhere in the outskirts of London. It was just surrounded by all these like bland like brick like apartment buildings, concrete, structures that all just kind of look the same. It was kind of a very rundown neighborhood, broken windows. But in the neighborhood, a little bit next to the neighborhood, there was an old factory mill, a nice little cozy brick factory mill. I think cozy would probably be the best word to describe it, with a nice tilted roof. There were plants outside. There were people walking around. There were nice wooden tables. It's a nice little quaint coffee shop that you may associate with maybe the English countryside, just popped up in the a little bit outside of London or whatever city it was in. And he explained how this was probably one of the probably the nicest area of that neighborhood, because you could actually see like the amount of people going there. Like, people went there and they actually enjoyed their coffee. And he observed how there was actually a community at this one coffee shop, and there was pretty much none outside the apartment flats. And so he thinks, or he claims that as we lack beauty in, it's not just in architecture, but it's also art, because you go to an art museum, you'll just find like a sink, which sounds like a joke, but you'll find a sink there.
Yeah.
And it's people will say like, oh, the sink is beautiful because it works, but at the same time, we all have sinks. It's nothing really grand about it. It's just like, yeah, it works, cool. There's nothing like beautiful about it, what Scruton claims. And beauty isn't really determined by what is useful, but rather what brings us closer to truth. And again, this brings us right back to Plato, and specifically in the Phaedrus. So Scruton says that the idea of truth is more associated with a human experience and attaching ourselves to the community. And of course, I think this is best exemplified when you think of like different places in the world. You kind of think of different themes in terms of their architecture. So like maybe in the rural side of the UK or England, you'll see nice little neighborhood houses, maybe a mansion or castle surrounding the area, some common farms with sheep bouncing around and stone walls. That's kind of what you associate with that community. And then if you move to maybe like rural China, you'll find rice flats. You'll find very well irrigated mountains. How they basically like carve steps into the mountains to irrigate rice. Like that's very unique to its to that region of the world. Or well, it's unique. That idea is unique to that region of the world, yeah. And it's kind of seen as pleasing, not just because it works, but because there's some sort of like identity there.
Mm-hmm.
And so basically, this idea of identity brings us, it brings us closer to community values and truth, and this kind of relates to I guess more of a local pride, I guess, some sort of patriotism, not essentially like nationalism or even religious fervor. It's more just be placing yourself in a part of the world and saying like, I'm part of this, not just blandly saying like I do this because I have to. It's more of like doing it because like this is what like defines you as an individual. And and so that's why it was a bit like I said, it was a bit complicated at the beginning, because communal truth in terms of Scruton is a little difficult to explain, because it actually depends on the community itself. Like, I can't say like what is beautiful is the same in like rural Japan and compared to what's beautiful in maybe the cities of Egypt. And you can pretty much do that with almost any place in the world. Yeah, and that's essentially like the argument, the last part of the argument I'm trying to make, because all of these have to deal with some sort of truth, and as beauty in a Platonic sense will actually lead to truth, because truth is beautiful in some sort of way, because well, it depends on who you're asking. It could mean it brings you closer to God, it answers the questions of the universe in more of a scientific sense, or it actually just like creates better communities. So that's essentially why people would be aesthetic objectivists.
Okay, yeah, I think that's definitely a very compelling argument. I think this is backtracking a bit, but when you were talking about like the drab apartment flats, that reminded me. There was like some study done on like kind of like uh, colors and kind of bland structures and how that kind of affects like the human mindset, and that's gone into studies and implications a lot in different workforces to try to uh, promote better productivity. And like it has been studied that like those dreary, bland, like square rooms, square halls, square structures of like the apartment flats do kind of negatively impact the human psyche. So yeah, I think you make a really compelling argument for why we would want to be an aesthetic objectivist, as it helps answers questions, bring you closer to God if you are religious, and how it can just make you a happier person individually and in your own community. It's about all we have for the podcast here today. Make sure to like and subscribe and be on the lookout for new videos.
There
I'm
won't be any
Josh.
new videos, but okay.
I'll be making new videos. Thank you for watching.
Yeah, thank you.